The jungle in 1944 did not announce danger politely. It revealed it in fragments, broken branches, displaced air, a sound that arrived before understanding. An American patrol moved cautiously through the Pacific canopy when the forest itself seemed to tear open. Not with the deep, measured thunder of a machine gun, but with a ripping cadence, lighter, faster, and disturbingly close. For a moment, no one could name it. They only felt it. Leaves disintegrated mid-air. Bark splintered. The earth erupted in short, violent kicks. Men dropped flat without orders, instincts overriding training. This was not the sound they had been taught to fear. It lacked the weight of a heavy gun, the pause of a rifle volley. Instead, it filled space continuously, like rainfall made of steel. Somewhere across the line, Japanese soldiers would later give it a name: Tetsu no Ame, Iron Rain. The sound did something stranger than suppress movement. It confused expectation. American troops knew the rhythm of enemy weapons. They could tell distance by echo, caliber by cadence. This noise offered no such clarity. It moved like a swarm, not a strike. Too sustained to be a submachine gun, too light to be a belt-fed heavy weapon. It pressed down on the senses, flattening thought as effectively as bodies. What made it unsettling was not just what it did, but what it implied. The weapon firing was not supposed to exist in this form. Doctrine had no place for it. Supply tables did not account for it. It sounded improvised, almost accidental, yet it behaved with purpose. Through brief gaps in the foliage, some caught a glimpse of the silhouette. Compact, familiar. An American M1 carbine, yet transformed into something unrecognizable by its own behavior. The war, for a heartbeat, seemed to hesitate. Not because the firing stopped, but because understanding lagged behind experience. In that narrow window between noise and knowledge, fear settled in. And as the jungle absorbed the echoes, one question lingered unspoken among the men pressed into the mud. How had a weapon meant for the rear found a way to command the front? The M1 carbine did not begin as a vision of battlefield dominance. It was born from compromise, an answer to a logistical question rather than a tactical dream. In 1940, the U.S. Army faced a simple problem. Too many men were going to war with weapons that were either too heavy or too few. Officers, drivers, radio operators, mortar crews, men whose duties placed them near combat but not at its center, needed something lighter than a rifle, but more reassuring than a pistol. What emerged was a small, fast-handling firearm chambered in .30 carbine. Weighing just over 5 pounds, it could be carried without fatigue and fired with minimal recoil. Its effective range was modest. Its stopping power debated even before it reached the field. But none of that concerned its designers. The carbine was never meant to dominate ground. It was meant to free hands, save weight, and offer a last line of defense. American planners saw it as a convenience weapon, an administrative solution made of steel and wood. In training manuals and supply charts, its place was clearly marked. This was not a rifle for assaults. It was not a weapon to anchor a squad. It existed to be there when something went wrong, not to shape what came next. Doctrine accepted its limits because doctrine defined its use. No one imagined it forcing fire superiority in dense jungle. No one imagined it pinning an enemy unit in place. And certainly no one imagined it fed by belts of ammunition, pouring continuous fire into foliage and earth. That idea lived outside official thinking, beyond the edges of what was authorized or even discussed. In depots and classrooms, the M1 carbine's identity seemed settled. It had a role, a label, and a ceiling it was never expected to break. But wars have a way of testing assumptions more brutally than planning ever can. And far from drafting tables and approval stamps, combat was already beginning to disagree. The Pacific War did not reward theory. It dismantled it. Concepts forged on European training grounds, fields of fire, measured advances, carefully spaced formations collapsed the moment boots sank into jungle mud. Islands reduced warfare to its most intimate scale. Engagements no longer unfolded across hundreds of yards, but across 20, sometimes less. Distance vanished. Surprise did not. Visibility died first. The jungle absorbed sight, bent sound, and distorted direction. A position could be invisible until it was lethal. Japanese soldiers mastered this environment with patience and economy. They appeared without warning, fired with precision, and dissolve back into foliage before retaliation could find a target. To the men advancing through green darkness, the enemy felt omnipresent and unreachable at the same time. In this world, volume of fire mattered more than accuracy. Not because bullets struck more often, but because they denied movement. Fire superiority became psychological before it became tactical. The side that filled space with noise and impact dictated behavior. Men moved when sound allowed it. They froze when it did not. Suppression was no longer a supporting act. It was the language of survival. American squads felt the imbalance quickly. Heavy machine guns were powerful, but slow to reposition. The Browning automatic rifle offered authority, but only in narrow arcs and brief bursts. Every reload created silence. Every silence invited movement, often from the wrong side. Soldiers wanted something else. Sustained fire without the burden of heavy guns. Continuity without exhaustion. What doctrine could not supply, necessity began to imagine. Men stopped asking what weapons were meant to do, and started asking what they needed them to do now. Ammunition weight became negotiable. Caliber became secondary. Reliability under continuous fire mattered more than elegance. The jungle did not reward purity, it rewarded function. Improvisation did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as pressure. Under constant contact, under fleeting silhouettes and sudden eruptions of fire, the idea took shape quietly. If visibility was lost, then control had to be heard. And somewhere between fear and necessity, soldiers began bending tools toward purposes they were never designed to serve. For American infantry doctrine, the Browning automatic rifle stood at the center of belief. It was the squad's anchor, the instrument through which firepower was meant to flow. Accurate, powerful, and battle-tested, the BAR carried authority not just in its caliber, but in its reputation. From Europe to training fields at home, it symbolized control-measured bursts, disciplined fire, and dominance through precision. But authority carries weight. Nearly 20 pounds when loaded, the BAR demanded strength, endurance, and space. In the open fields it had been designed for, those demands were acceptable. In the Pacific jungle they became liabilities. Humidity soaked into metal and wood alike. Sweat and rain turned every movement into labor. What had once felt solid now felt burdensome, slow to pivot, slower still to recover. 1 bar per squad made sense on paper. In practice, the jungle refused geometry. Threats emerged from flanks, from behind, from angles no training diagram could capture. A single automatic weapon could not be everywhere at once. When it fired, it dominated one slice of terrain and left the rest exposed. When it stopped, even briefly, silence arrived with consequence. Reloads were the most dangerous moments. The BAR's 20-round magazine vanished quickly under sustained contact. Each pause created a gap the enemy instinctively exploited. Japanese soldiers did not need to overpower fire superiority, they waited for its interruption. Movement followed silence. Silence followed reload. And in those seconds, men were wounded, pinned, or lost entirely. Commanders saw the problem, but not its solution. Doctrine had worked before. It had been written with care, refined through experience, and validated by tradition. Trusting it felt rational. Questioning it felt reckless. So adaptations came slowly, filtered through hierarchy and hesitation. The belief persisted that discipline could compensate for environment, that training could overcome terrain. Arrogance did not announce itself as pride. It arrived as confidence in established systems, as reluctance to accept that the battlefield had changed faster than the manual. While squads adapted instinctively shifting positions, sharing ammunition, seeking constant fire, official thinking lagged behind. The BAR remained respected, even as its limits became unmistakable. The jungle was not impressed by reputation. It punished pauses, magnified weight, and exploited rigidity. And as the cost of waiting grew clearer with every engagement, a quiet truth settled in. If the squad's central weapon could not adapt, then something else would have to. Somewhere between doctrine and desperation, that realization was already taking shape. The idea did not come from a laboratory or a design bureau. It emerged quietly at the front, where necessity stripped problems down to their simplest form. Frontline armorers, men trained to repair, not reinvent, began to experiment in the margins of regulation. They worked after hours, with scavenged parts and unspoken permission. What they were chasing was not elegance, but relief. Experience had already taught them a harsh lesson. Extra ammunition mattered more than caliber. In the jungle, a bullet that denied movement was often more valuable than one that promised penetration. Suppression created time. Time created options. And options, more often than not, kept men alive. The arithmetic of survival began to change. Sustained fire outweighed theoretical lethality. A weapon that could keep the enemy's head down even imperfectly could decide an engagement before accuracy ever entered the equation. Armorers listened to the complaints of riflemen and squad leaders alike. The pauses were killing them. Reloads were invitations. Silence was danger. Then someone voiced the question no manual had prepared for. What if the carbine never stopped firing? What if its greatest weakness, light ammunition, limited power, was offset by continuity? It was an idea that violated intent. The M1 carbine was not built for endurance. It was not meant to carry the burden of suppression, yet it was everywhere. Light, familiar, trusted. The problems were immediate and obvious. Heat threatened to warp metal and ruin accuracy. Feeding ammunition reliably under jungle conditions bordered on fantasy. Timing, gas pressure, cycling speed, where posed risks no one could fully calculate. Every solution created a new failure point. Nothing about the idea was clean. Official channels answered quickly and predictably. No, the weapon was not rated for sustained fire. No, modifications would compromise reliability. No, supply and maintenance could not support such deviation. The answers were correct on paper. They were useless in combat. Because combat did not wait for approval. It responded only to effect. Men pinned under fire did not care whether a solution had been authorized. They cared whether it worked long enough to move. And so the experiments continued not as rebellion, but as adaptation. Each contact refined the idea. Each failure taught restraint. Each success encouraged another attempt. What began as a question slowly hardened into intent. If the jungle demanded constant sound, then someone would give it that sound whether doctrine allowed it or not. And with every improvised adjustment, the line between impossible and inevitable grew thinner. Belt-fed weapons belonged to a different philosophy of war. They were products of industry and scale, designed to dominate fixed ground and prepared positions. Ammunition belts symbolized abundance factories, feeding fronts, steel arriving faster than men could fire it. In doctrine, belts meant permanence. They were paired with tripods, crews, and sectors of fire carefully measured on maps. To apply that logic to a light rifle bordered on heresy. The M1 carbine had been designed around restraint, limited recoil, modest heat tolerance. A receiver never intended to endure sustained stress. To imagine it, swallowing belts of ammunition and firing continuously seemed absurd, even irresponsible. Engineers, when consulted informally, doubted the metal would hold. The locking system, they warned, was not built for punishment. Wear would be rapid. Failure inevitable. Officers doubted something else entirely. The point. Belt-fed fire was heavy by nature. Belts snagged, dragged, demanded discipline and preparation. Why burden a light weapon with the very problems it was meant to avoid? Why risk reliability for a concept that violated everything the carbine stood for? From their perspective, the logic collapsed under its own contradiction. But the jungle did not participate in these debates. It did not weigh theory against tradition. It imposed conditions and waited for compliance. Fire came without warning. Contact happened at distances too close for doctrine to matter. And in those moments, the question was never whether an idea made sense, only whether it worked. Unofficially, the experiment moved forward, not with confidence, but with curiosity sharpened by necessity. Belts were shortened, reconfigured, guided by improvisation rather than design. Feed systems were tested and discarded. Armorers watched for cracks, listened for changes in rhythm, learned what the metal would tolerate before it protested. Each attempt pushed the carbine closer to a role it had never been assigned. Arrogance lingered in the background, not as cruelty, but as institutional certainty. The belief that doctrine knew best, that deviations were dangerous distractions, that the answer to jungle warfare lay in discipline, not innovation. Yet every successful burst of sustained fire challenged that belief quietly, without argument. The weapon did not become elegant, it became functional. It sounded wrong, looked wrong, and defied classification. But when it spoke, it filled space in a way nothing else could. The belts rattled. The receiver strained. And still, the fire continued long enough to matter. What doctrine dismissed as absurd, combat began to test in earnest. And as unofficial solutions proved their worth under fire, the line between sanctioned design and battlefield necessity blurred even further. Somewhere ahead, the jungle was waiting to decide whether this logic would fail or finally justify itself. Nothing about the work was clean. There were no blueprints, no sanctioned parts lists, no expectation that the result would last beyond the next contact. Feed mechanisms were adapted from whatever could be found: salvaged links, modified guides, improvised housings bent and filed by hand. Each solution existed only until it failed, and failure was frequent. But every breakdown carried instruction. Ammunition belts, so orderly on factory floors, behaved differently in the jungle. They snagged on vines without warning. Mud packed itself into links. Sweat corroded metal faster than oil could protect it. Gravity worked against the gunner, pulling belts into tangles at the worst moments. The weapon demanded attention not just when firing, but constantly hands managing steel serpents while eyes scanned foliage. Inside the receiver, strain accumulated. The gas system, never designed for uninterrupted cycles, worked beyond its intended rhythm. Springs fatigued. Timing drifted. Parts that functioned flawlessly in short bursts began to stutter under sustained demand. Every extended engagement risked catastrophic failure. But the alternative silence felt worse. Barrels heated faster than doctrine had predicted, faster than manuals had warned. Thin steel glowed invisibly under humidity and shade, heat trapped by jungle air that refused to dissipate it. Accuracy degraded quickly. Warping became a concern. Gunners learned to fire in controlled surges rather than endless streams, riding the edge between suppression and self-destruction. The weapon taught restraint even as it promised excess. Failures came early and often. Belts jammed mid-burst, receivers cracked, gas pistons seized. In one engagement, a feed failure arrived seconds before a Japanese countermove, and only luck prevented casualties. Lessons learned in classrooms took months. Lessons learned under fire took seconds and were remembered permanently. What manuals explained abstractly, combat explained precisely. Armorers adjusted angles by millimeters. They polished feed ramps, reshaped guides, shortened belts to balance endurance against reliability. Nothing was standardized. Each weapon became a personality, known by its sounds, its tolerances, its limits. Men learned which guns could be trusted for longer bursts, which demanded careful pacing. Solutions did not emerge through elegance. They emerged through repetition. Each engagement refined instinct. Each night brought quiet modification under dim light. Files scraping softly. Springs tested by hand. There was no illusion that this was the future of warfare. It was simply the present, demanding answers now. The weapon that emerged bore little resemblance to official diagrams. It was heavier than intended, louder than expected, less accurate than ideal. But it did something nothing else could. It filled space continuously. It erased the pauses that the enemy had learned to exploit. Where reloads once created opportunity, now there was only sound. That sound became its defining feature, not the deep roar of a machine gun, but a relentless, ripping cadence, higher pitched, closer, harder to place. It did not announce dominance. It imposed it. Enemy movement slowed. Counterfire hesitated. The jungle itself seemed to recoil from the sustained disturbance. A crude rhythm took shape, terrifying precisely because it was unfamiliar. It was not doctrine made manifest. It was compromise made audible. Steel strained against intention. Springs fought exhaustion. Men balanced aggression with mechanical sympathy. And in that balance, something new was born. Not a perfect weapon, but a functional one. Innovation, in this case, was not about improvement. It was about survival. The carbine, pushed beyond its design, responded just enough to justify the effort. It did not last forever. It did not need to. It only needed to last long enough to change the terms of the fight. And when it finally did, when the sound carried across the trees and forced the enemy to pause, the men behind it understood something quietly profound. Effectiveness did not require permission. It required results. Ahead of them, the jungle waited for the first true test of this imperfect creation. The first true test did not come by plan. It came the way most moments did in the Pacific: sudden, compressed, unavoidable. A patrol moved through uneven ground when fire erupted from concealment ahead. Short bursts at first. Disciplined, familiar. Men reacted instinctively, dropping into cover, returning fire into shapes they could barely see. For a moment, the engagement followed expectation. Then the new weapon spoke. The sound cut through the jungle without warning, not rising in volume so much as refusing to stop. It was immediate and continuous, filling the narrow space between trees with a relentless cadence. Leaves shredded. Dirt jumped. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Japanese movement halted almost at once, not because casualties were immediate, but because uncertainty was absolute. Continuous fire did what precision could not. It pinned movement instantly. Japanese soldiers, trained to exploit pauses and angles, found none. Every attempt to reposition met noise and impact. The weapon did not hunt targets. It erased opportunity. The jungle, once an ally of concealment, became a liability under constant disturbance. Ballistically, the effect was unremarkable. The .30 carbine round did not punch through earthworks or thick trunks with authority, but psychologically, the effect was decisive. The sound carried weight beyond its caliber. It suggested abundance. It implied that the firing would not end. Men under it could not tell where it came from, only that it filled space they needed to cross. American soldiers advanced not behind certainty, but behind sound. They moved while the fire continued, trusting the noise to hold what vision could not confirm. Each step forward was measured against rhythm rather than sight. The weapon created a corridor, not of safety, but of possibility. In the jungle, that distinction mattered little. Enemy counterfire faltered, not from fear alone, but from disruption. Coordination depended on timing and cues that no longer existed. Orders were lost in noise. Signals went unseen. The sustained fire fractured cohesion before tactics could adjust. Where counterattacks might once have surged during reloads, now there were no gaps to exploit. Momentum shifted in seconds. What began as contact hardened into advantage almost immediately. The squad's movement accelerated. Positions were flanked before defenders could reorient. Suppression became something more than support. It became the decisive act itself. The weapon did not win the fight alone, but it dictated its tempo. Men noticed the change, even as it unfolded. The absence of the familiar pause felt unnatural. There was no counting of rounds, no waiting for the next burst. The fire simply continued, forcing the enemy to react continuously rather than choose moments. It was not overwhelming. It was unrelenting. When the firing finally ceased, the silence felt heavier than usual. Steam rose from disturbed earth. The jungle settled slowly, reluctantly. Men exchanged looks that carried no celebration, only recognition. Something had shifted. Not permanently, perhaps. Not officially, but undeniably. Reports filtered back in fragments. Descriptions focused less on kills and more on effect. They couldn't move. They didn't fire back right away. We advanced while it was still going. No one spoke of elegance. No one spoke of doctrine. They spoke of time gained, ground taken, lives spared. Word spread quietly. Not through orders, but through experience. Squads asked for the weapon when available. Armorers listened closely. Officers tolerated what they did not yet endorse. The jungle had delivered its verdict without ceremony. Suppression had become victory not by destruction, but by control. And somewhere beyond the trees, the enemy was already beginning to name the sound that had disrupted their confidence. They would call it Iron Rain, and they would remember it long after the firing stopped. On the other side of the jungle, the effect was recorded in a different language but with the same precision of fear. Japanese units were trained to observe, to report, to classify. They understood American firepower in familiar categories: rifles, bars, machine guns. Each had a rhythm, a weight, a predictable place in the fight. But what they began to encounter in 1944 did not fit any of those patterns. Reports described an unnatural volume of fire, not the heavy, deliberate thunder of a water-cooled gun, not the slow, authoritative bursts of a fixed position. This fire was constant light enough to travel quickly through foliage, sustained enough to deny movement, close enough to feel personal. It seemed to come from a weapon that could move with the infantry while still sounding like something meant to be emplaced. The sound became its signature long before its mechanics were understood. In the jungle, sound was often more reliable than sight. You could not always see the enemy, but you could measure him by cadence. And this cadence resisted measurement. It arrived suddenly, persisted without pause, then vanished as abruptly as it began. That unpredictability disrupted more than tactics. It disrupted expectation. Japanese troops were disciplined, but discipline depended on a world that obeyed certain rules. Ambushes relied on timing. Countermoves relied on pauses. Withdrawal relied on windows of silence. When those windows disappeared, movement became gamble. Under sustained fire, even a well-trained soldier hesitated not from weakness, but from calculation. The price of being wrong in jungle warfare was immediate. Somewhere in that process between reports and whispered conversations at night, the weapon gained a name: Tetsu no Ame, Iron Rain. It was not a technical label. It was a description of sensation. Rain could not be flanked. It could not be outmaneuvered. It simply fell, indifferent to courage. And the name carried a quiet recognition. This was not just a gun. It was an atmosphere. Fear spread faster than understanding. Men did not need to know the weapon's caliber or design to feel its effect. They only needed to experience the way it pressed down on decision-making. It stole initiative by denying timing. It punished movement so consistently that even the boldest tactics began to feel fragile. In that way, noise became a kind of engineering shaping behavior without requiring direct hits. Tactical confidence eroded first in small ways. Units delayed movement until fire slackened, only to find it did not. Officers struggled to coordinate under a sound that drowned voices and confused signals. Communication lines, already strained by terrain, snapped under the pressure of constant disruption. When men cannot hear orders, they fall back on instinct. And instinct under Iron Rain often meant stillness. Morale bent under noise alone. That was the weapon's most unsettling achievement. It did not need to destroy positions to weaken them. It only needed to convince the men inside them that movement was impossible. In the jungle, where concealment had once offered security, sustained fire made concealment feel like a trap, because escape required a moment that never arrived. The irony was sharp. Japanese doctrine valued aggression, infiltration, the sudden strike. These tactics depended on an opponent's hesitation and limited fire capacity. Iron Rain reversed that relationship. It forced hesitation onto the attacker. It made infiltration riskier, assaults slower, and the psychological edge so often decisive in close combat less reliable. By the time the weapon was named, its technical truth mattered less than its lived reality. It had entered the war as a rumor carried on sound. It became a threat not because it was perfect, but because it was unexpected. And once a weapon is feared, it begins to shape the battlefield even before it fires. In Japanese accounts, the phrase Iron Rain lingered not as exaggeration, but as warning. Because in the Pacific, the side that controlled tempo controlled survival. And somewhere ahead, American units were beginning to realize that this unofficial innovation was not merely useful, it was changing how the enemy thought. The turning point was no longer about steel alone. It was about belief. Doctrines rarely collapse all at once. They fracture quietly, under pressure, in places where authority cannot always see. In the Pacific, American squads began rethinking how fire was distributed not as a matter of theory, but as a response to repeated survival. The question was no longer how to place fire according to manuals, but how to maintain it long enough to move. Suppression replaced precision in key moments. Not permanently, not universally, but decisively. Leaders learned when accuracy mattered and when continuity mattered more. In dense jungle, targets were often fleeting or invisible. Fire that denied movement proved more valuable than fire that promised hits. The goal shifted from killing what could not be seen to controlling what could not be predicted. Movement accelerated under artificial cover. Continuous fire created windows where none had existed before. Squads advanced not because the enemy was destroyed, but because the enemy was disrupted. The difference was subtle but profound. Fire no longer followed maneuver as support. Maneuver followed fire as consequence. Tempo changed, and with it, confidence. In this environment, the M1 Carbine's identity began to change. It was no longer merely a defensive convenience for rear area troops. It became, in certain hands and under specific conditions, a tool of initiative. Its light weight allowed it to move with the squad. Its modified behavior allowed it to shape engagements. The carbine did not replace established weapons, but it challenged assumptions about what roles were fixed. Officers noticed even if they did not always approve. Reports arrived describing improved movement, reduced casualties during contact, and faster resolution of engagements. The language was careful. Innovations were framed as situational adaptations rather than formal changes. Tolerance replaced endorsement. Silence replaced orders. In wartime, that was often permission enough. Adaptation spread quietly, not through memoranda or training schedules, but through observation. One unit saw another advance under sustained fire and asked how it was done. Armorers shared solutions informally. Squad leaders adjusted formations without announcing doctrine shifts. What worked was repeated. What failed was abandoned. The battlefield served as editor. This quiet evolution exposed a deeper truth about warfare. Doctrine exists to guide behavior until reality intervenes. In the jungle, reality intervened constantly. The environment punished rigidity and rewarded responsiveness. Units that adapted survived with fewer losses. Units that waited for authorization paid in blood. The carbine, once defined by its limitations, now occupied a gray space between categories. It was neither rifle nor machine gun. It was not meant to be standardized, yet its effect was undeniable. It forced planners to confront an uncomfortable idea that effectiveness could emerge outside approved channels, and that improvisation could outperform intention. The rulebook did not disappear. It became irrelevant in moments that mattered most. Under fire, men did not consult diagrams. They relied on what had worked the last time. And increasingly, what had worked involved sustained sound, controlled chaos, and weapons used beyond their original purpose. The turning point was not marked by ceremony or announcement. It revealed itself in behavior. Squads moved faster. Contacts resolved sooner. Enemy reactions grew hesitant. Confidence shifted not because of new equipment, but because of new understanding. Fire was no longer just a means of destruction. It was a means of communication. By the time higher command fully recognized the change, the battlefield had already rewritten the rulebook. Not with ink, but with experience. And as the war pressed on, one question lingered unresolved. Would this adaptation reshape the future? Or would it vanish once the jungle no longer demanded it? Jungle combat rewarded immediacy above all else. It punished delay, hesitation, and the careful sequencing that doctrine prized. In an environment where visibility collapsed and contact arrived without warning, the side that reacted first often dictated the outcome. Speed was not measured in meters gained, but in seconds denied to the enemy. Iron Rain fit that reality precisely not because it was powerful, but because it was immediate. Volume overwhelmed concealment. The jungle's greatest defense was its ability to hide movement, to fracture sightlines and absorb sound. But sustained fire stripped that advantage away. Leaves no longer concealed approach when they were constantly torn apart. Earthworks offered less confidence when the ground around them never settled. Continuous impact transformed concealment into exposure by making every position feel temporary. Sustained noise disrupted coordination in ways bullets alone could not. Jungle warfare depended on timing, brief signals, shouted commands, moments of silence that allowed movement to synchronize. Iron Rain erased those moments. Orders were lost in its cadence. Signals went unseen. Units that relied on precise execution found themselves reacting individually rather than acting collectively. Control dissolved under pressure. Lightweight ammunition enabled endurance. The .30 carbine round, criticized for its limited stopping power, revealed a different virtue under sustained fire. It allowed gunners to carry more rounds without exhaustion. Belts could be replenished faster. Fire could be maintained longer. Endurance mattered more than individual lethality because it extended control over time. The fight did not hinge on decisive strikes, but on who could keep the pressure on. The system's flaws mattered less than its effect. Overheating, wear, and imperfect reliability were real concerns, but they were measured against immediate results. A weapon that functioned imperfectly for minutes could still decide an engagement that lasted seconds. In that calculus, longevity surrendered importance to influence. The carbine did not need to be perfect. It needed to be present. Psychology eclipsed ballistics. Iron Rain succeeded not because it destroyed, but because it convinced. It convinced the enemy that movement was unsafe, the timing was unreliable, that initiative carried unacceptable risk. It convinced American squads that advancement was possible even without certainty. Confidence shifted not through kills, but through control of tempo. The battlefield responded accordingly. War revealed priorities with ruthless clarity. It stripped weapons of their intended roles and judged them by outcomes alone. The jungle did not care about caliber debates or theoretical penetration. It cared about whether a unit could move, whether contact could be broken, whether momentum could be seized. Iron Rain answered those questions consistently enough to matter. In hindsight, the logic appears simple. Continuous sound denied opportunity. Opportunity denied became advantage gained. But simplicity emerged only after experience. Before that, the idea had seemed illogical, even reckless. It contradicted design intent and challenged institutional comfort. Yet in combat, logic is defined by consequence, not origin. The weapon worked because it aligned with the environment's demands rather than resisting them. It accepted chaos instead of trying to impose order. It traded precision for presence, perfection for persistence. In doing so, it revealed a broader truth about warfare. Effectiveness often belongs to those willing to abandon ideals when reality demands it. Iron Rain did not represent a technological breakthrough. It represented a philosophical one. It showed that in certain battles, fear could be engineered as deliberately as steel. That sound could shape behavior as decisively as impact. That control did not require destruction, only denial. As the war pressed on, these lessons lingered quietly. They were not codified, not celebrated. They existed in the habits of men who had moved under sustained fire and survived. And while the jungle would eventually fall silent, the priorities it revealed would not be forgotten, at least not by those who had learned them the hard way. The same forces that made Iron Rain effective also set strict limits on its life. Mechanical stress accumulated quickly under sustained fire. Receivers flexed beyond their intended tolerances. Springs fatigued. Feed systems that functioned acceptably for brief engagements degraded rapidly with repetition. What worked in minutes did not always survive weeks. The weapon answered immediate needs, but it exacted a price over time. Overheating shortened service life more reliably than enemy fire. Barrels endured temperatures they were never designed to manage, especially in air that refused to cool them. Accuracy eroded, components warped. Armorers could mitigate damage, but not eliminate it. Each repair extended usefulness temporarily, never indefinitely. The Carbine pushed past design limits, reminded its users that improvisation had boundaries. Logistics added another layer of strain. Unconventional supply chains challenged an army built on predictability. Ammunition belts required maintenance, cleaning, and replacement. Spare parts were scavenged rather than issued. What could be supported at platoon level became problematic at scale. An innovation that thrived in isolation struggled when multiplied. As the war moved forward and environments changed, the urgency that had justified deviation began to fade. Open terrain returned. Visibility improved. Heavy weapons regained relevance. The jungle's demands loosened their grip, and with them, the need for constant improvisation. What had been necessary became optional. What was optional became inconvenient. Post-war doctrine sealed the outcome. Military institutions favored standardization for reasons both practical and philosophical. Uniform training reduced error. Interchangeable parts simplified logistics. Clear categories preserved control. Iron Rain fit none of these priorities. It resisted codification. It existed between definitions. In peacetime planning, ambiguity was a liability. The idea survived in memory rather than policy. Veterans recalled it vividly, not as a design triumph, but as a moment of relief under pressure. Official histories focused on weapons that scaled cleanly, that fit procurement models and doctrine charts. Improvisation, by its nature, did not. It left few records, fewer schematics, and almost no advocates once the war ended. Innovation retreated into footnotes. It appeared briefly in after-action reports, in marginal notes that acknowledged unofficial modifications without elaboration. Engineers moved on to new conflicts, new requirements, new technologies. The Carbine returned to its original identity. Iron Rain faded into anecdote. History prefers clean lines. It favors clear progressions, approved designs, and sanctioned breakthroughs. Messy adaptations complicate the narrative. They challenge the idea that wars are won by planning alone. Iron Rain belonged to that uncomfortable category: effective, unsanctioned, and temporary. Yet its disappearance was not a failure. It was a consequence of context. The weapon existed because the jungle demanded it. When the jungle no longer spoke as loudly, the weapon fell silent. That did not diminish its impact. It defined it. The lesson endured quietly. That innovation born of necessity may not last, but it can decide moments that matter most. And in war, moments often outweigh legacies. As post-war doctrine reasserted order and predictability, the memory of Iron Rain receded, waiting, perhaps, for another battlefield where necessity would again rewrite the rules. When the war moved on, what remained did not exist on paper. Veterans remembered sounds more than schematics. They recalled the way the jungle changed when Iron Rain began, not visually, but emotionally. The constant tearing of foliage, the pressure it placed on decision-making. Few could have drawn the weapon accurately from memory, but many could still describe its rhythm. In combat, that rhythm had mattered more than its design. Official histories told a cleaner story. They documented divisions, operations, and approved weapon systems. Improvisation appeared only at the margins, if at all. It complicated the narrative of orderly progress and institutional foresight. The idea that frontline necessity had quietly reshaped tactics did not fit comfortably into post-war summaries, so it was largely left out. Engineers moved on to new wars and new problems. Cold War planning demanded different answers: range, penetration, mechanization, nuclear shadow. Jungle improvisations offered few transferable lessons to an era obsessed with standardization and scale. Design bureaus favored controlled testing environments, not chaotic adaptation. The future belonged to weapons that could be mass-produced, documented, and trained uniformly. The M1 Carbine returned to its original identity. In museums and manuals, it resumed its place as a lightweight defensive arm issued to support troops, praised for portability, criticized for limited power. The brief moment when it had behaved like something else entirely faded from institutional memory. The weapon became what it had always been intended to be, not what it had once become. Iron Rain survived only as anecdote. A story told between men who had shared contact in green darkness. A reference that required explanation, then silence. Without schematics or official endorsement, it existed as memory rather than artifact. As years passed, even those memories softened, compressed by time into a few telling details and long pauses. The lessons remained unofficial. They lived in habits rather than doctrines, in the understanding that fire could shape behavior before it destroyed bodies, that sound could be as decisive as steel. These ideas resurfaced occasionally under different names, in different wars, but rarely with acknowledgement of their origins. Innovation born in isolation tends to lose its lineage. Memory simplifies necessity. What had once been a complex response to unforgiving terrain became a curious footnote, then a rumor. Context was stripped away. The jungle that had demanded constant fire was forgotten. The fear that had driven experimentation dissolved into abstraction. Without pressure, the logic lost urgency. And yet, beneath that simplification, something endured. The knowledge that effectiveness is often situational. That doctrine bends most under stress. That the most influential tools are sometimes those never meant to exist. These truths did not disappear. They waited, dormant, for environments that would demand them again. After the islands fell silent, Iron Rain did not echo through armories or textbooks. It echoed through recollection, in the way veterans paused when describing certain engagements, in the way they spoke of movement, made possible by sound alone. History moved forward, streamlined and selective, but beneath its clean lines remained the residue of necessity, a reminder that war does not always reward intention, and that some of its most decisive moments leave no official trace at all. Firepower has always spoken before it struck. Long before casualties are counted, before positions are taken or lost, sound communicates intent. In the jungle, this truth revealed itself with unusual clarity. A weapon's effect was measured not only by what it destroyed, but by what it persuaded men not to do. Iron Rain spoke fluently in that language. Suppression shaped human behavior more reliably than doctrine ever could. Men under sustained fire did not debate tactics, they adapted instinctively. Movement slowed. Decisions narrowed. Initiative became expensive. The weapon did not need to see its enemy to influence him. It only needed to deny options. In that denial, behavior bent. Fear, in this context, was not accidental. It was engineered as deliberately as steel and springs, not through brutality, but through consistency. Uncertainty became the pressure point. When silence could no longer be predicted, timing collapsed. When timing collapsed, confidence followed. Iron Rain did not terrorize through excess, it unsettled through persistence. This was not innovation born of foresight. It emerged from pressure, not planning. No committee approved it. No doctrine anticipated it. It arose because reality demanded something existing tools could not provide. Under enough strain, men stopped asking whether an idea was correct and asked only whether it worked. That question stripped away pride and left function. The jungle taught humility without explanation. It did not care what weapons were designed to do. It did not respect rank, reputation, or precedent. It rewarded those who listened closely to sound, to reaction, to consequence. Those who imposed theory without adjustment paid for it. Those who adapted endured. Victory, in these conditions, came not from mastery, but from attentiveness, from recognizing when assumptions failed, from allowing reality to revise belief. Iron Rain was not a triumph of engineering, it was a concession to environment. It succeeded because it aligned with what the jungle demanded rather than what doctrine preferred. War rewards adaptation over purity. Clean concepts fracture under contact. Perfect systems rarely survive, first use unchanged. What persists are the adjustments made under pressure, the compromises that trade elegance for survival. Iron Rain existed in that uncomfortable space. It was neither refined nor permanent. It was effective. The moral weight of that lesson lingers beyond this weapon, beyond this war. Innovation does not always arrive polished. Sometimes it arrives as noise in the trees, unsettling and unofficial. Sometimes it is named by the enemy before it is acknowledged by its creator. And sometimes it disappears once the pressure lifts, leaving only memory and implication behind. Fire, when used this way, becomes more than force. It becomes message. It tells the enemy when to stop, when to hesitate, when to abandon confidence. It tells one's own side when to move. In the Pacific jungle, Iron Rain spoke clearly enough to matter. And though the weapon itself would fade, the language it revealed would remain waiting for the next battlefield, where sound would again speak louder than design, and necessity would once more ask men to listen. The weapon was never meant to exist. It had no place in procurement plans or training syllabi. No committee debated its merits. No engineer drafted it with permanence in mind. It emerged in defiance of intent, shaped not by vision but by pressure. Doctrine said no, not out of malice, but out of order. Order depends on predictability. Iron Rain did not. Necessity said no. It spoke without patience and without appeal. In the Pacific jungle, where distance collapsed and time narrowed to seconds, waiting for approval was indistinguishable from surrender. Men did not innovate because they wanted to challenge authority. They did so because silence was lethal, and sound could keep them alive. Belt-fed fire transformed a defensive tool into something else entirely. The M1 Carbine, conceived as a convenience, became a source of dominance, not through power, but through presence. It did not overpower the jungle. It negotiated with it. It filled space long enough to bend behavior. That was enough. The enemy named it before history did. Tetsu no Ame, Iron Rain. The name did not honor craftsmanship or ingenuity. It captured experience. It described what it felt like to exist beneath uninterrupted fire that could not be predicted or timed. In war, names bestowed by the enemy often reveal more truth than those assigned by designers. Iron Rain did not endure because it was not built to. When the jungle loosened its grip, the weapon lost its reason. Open terrain returned. Doctrine reasserted itself. Standardization reclaimed priority. The carbine resumed its original role, stripped once more of its brief transformation. The improvisation faded without ceremony. Yet disappearance did not equal insignificance. Iron Rain mattered because of when it existed, not how long. It mattered because it answered a specific question at a moment when answers were scarce. It demonstrated that effectiveness is situational, and that the battlefield reserves the right to overrule intention. They built it to survive the jungle. The jungle made it legendary. Legend, in this case, does not mean celebration. It means remembrance without records. It means an idea that lived only under pressure, then dissolved when that pressure lifted. It means a solution that left no lineage, only implication. And perhaps that is fitting. War does not reward purity. It rewards responsiveness. It does not preserve every innovation, only those that scale cleanly and endure bureaucratic peace. Others vanish, having served their purpose. Iron Rain belonged to the latter. It did not ask to be remembered. It only needed to be heard. In the end, its legacy is not found in museums or manuals, but in a quieter understanding that sometimes the most decisive tools are those that exist briefly, unofficially, and imperfectly. That necessity can create forms doctrine never would. And that history, for all its structure, is shaped just as often by moments it barely records. They laughed once. They never laughed again.